I don't know if that's good or bad. You know, at school, when they know you, especially if they know you at the principal's office, that's really not such a good thing. I spent many times visiting the principal's office because they knew my son quite well. But we won't go into that. Well, today is actually officially the first day of Advent, but in our preaching schedule, we're making it the second Sunday in Advent, and that is because we started our Advent series a week earlier. On the 22nd, we will be having a joint service with both Mandarin and the Cantonese congregations, and we hope all of you plan to attend. But we wanted to get in teaching on all of 4 parts of the Advent series. So today we have 2 candles lit. Last week we didn't have the Advent wreath up. It caught me by surprise, even though I knew what I was preaching on. Contrary to what some people think, I don't put it together Saturday night. We lit the prophet's candle last week, and that symbolizes hope. And this week we've lit the Bethlehem candle that symbolizes faith. Advent, as we said last week, is the season of watching and waiting, where we adopt a posture of watching and waiting in preparation for Christmas. My least favorite song of Christmas is called The 12 Days of Christmas. The 12 Days of Christmas start after Christmas, leading up to January 6th, which is, in tradition, is when the Magi arrived and bearing gifts. So the season leading up to Christmas is a season which is intended to be more reflective and not as celebrative and partying as sometimes we make it into be, because it's getting ready for what we are celebrating, what we are remembering at Christmas time. We enter to that posture of watching and waiting in 2 ways. One is by stepping back in time and getting a sense of what it meant for those for whom Jesus came the first time, what life was like for them. And as I said last week, while we do that, we also begin to remember and take to heart that there's many people today, many of whom celebrate Christmas, for whom Jesus has not come for the first time in their lives. And for some of us, some of you who became followers of Jesus as adults, it calls you to remember back to what life was like before that. So we enter into their experience and we develop a heart for connecting with them as well. But the second aspect of posture and waiting is one that we also don't talk a whole lot about, but should be ever present in our minds and hearts, and that is the second coming of Jesus. That it could happen anytime. But we enter into a posture watching, waiting, of actively waiting for that to take place. Bethlehem. You know, the visual image that most of us often have of Bethlehem is that of a quiet, sleepy little town where not much ever happens. We sing about it in our Christmas carols, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Second verse goes, for Christ is born of Mary and gathered all about, while mortals sleep and angels keep their watch of wondering love. And the last verse ends up, how silently the wondrous gift is given. Bethlehem is also pictured on our Christmas cards, isn't it? As this quiet little sleepy village. It shows up like that. I don't know why we think Joseph and Mary arrived at night. And by the way, palm trees don't grow around Bethlehem. So you got to be aware of getting your beliefs about Christmas from cards and Christmas carols, because they're a little bit misleading. And by the way, you know, in our house, I don't know if you set up nativity scenes. In our house, this is really important for me. You don't put the Magi on the scene with the shepherds. They arrived 2 years later, okay? They were, so we have all kinds of things that take place along the way. There's another sleepy little village of Bethlehem. So we have this way of thinking of Bethlehem. But I suspect nothing could be further from the reality of what was taking place in Bethlehem on that night that Jesus was born. Just consider for a moment the implications of some of the things that we just read. Something we probably go right on by and don't really stop to give more thought to, just a passing thought. So as a result of this decree that Caesar Augustus issued, Luke tells us that everyone went to their own town to register. And so Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. Now, think of what might have been taking place at the time. There's family members who had left to pursue life and perhaps work elsewhere. And they're all coming back home after being gone for a period of time. Perhaps being reminded, in the words of Jimmy Kimmel in one of his late night shows, and talking about the massive amount of people who were traveling back home in the U.S. for Thanksgiving. He says perhaps when they got back there, they were reminded why they left in the first place and weren't really happy about being back. But that's a different topic. But remember, this was not a time when people traveled for vacation or for leisure. And when they traveled, the main mode of traveling was on foot. So when you left home, you didn't necessarily make frequent trips back, nor was there any kind of regular way of keeping up in contact and communication with those who were back home. Nazareth, the city or the town that Joseph and Mary were living in, was about 150 to 160 kilometers away from Bethlehem. If you go on Google Maps, it says that's a little less than a 2-hour drive. In their time, that was a week to 10-day walk. So it was not just something you kind of did at the drop of a hat and said, hey, we just want to drop in and see what's going on. And once in a while, you went back home to see family. We lived for a little time being in Prince George, about 7 years of our life. Most of our family pretty much lives in the Lower Mainland. Now, this sounds a little bit cynical, but I determined that Prince George was the ideal place for us to live in relation to family. Because if something urgent was happening back home, in our flight, I was back in Vancouver. If it was important but wasn't urgent, a day's drive, I could make that day's drive. It was a great drive. But you know, if it was neither urgent or important, or it was one of those trivial things that families always deal with, I say, it's too bad. I wish we could be there, but we're not. So it was a great location to be, where you're close enough to stay in contact, but far enough away not to be drawn into all the family stuff that goes on, which of course I know your families are perfect and it doesn't happen to you at all that way. But in that time, 150, 160K was too far to make a regular trip back. So consequently, as people arrived from different places, there would have been family reunions taking place and friends meeting up with old friends that they hadn't seen for a while. Have you experienced that? What is it like when your family gets together? My family isn't particularly a loud, noisy kind of people, but when we get together after we haven't been around for a while, there's food, always food, of course. It has to be food that you eat together. There's a bit of wine that flows a little bit, and then we have great conversations. Our kids listen into all the stories that they heard every time we get together, of course, and are now bored silly with it, which, by the way, often get exaggerated and changed as the years go by. Truth is never there. It's someplace in the middle of that. And then our family is musical. We love to sing. So at some point, we're going to gather around the piano, and we're just going to sing together. We're just going to have a great time. So picture what is taking place in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is not quite that little sleepy little village that we often imagine or picture, because all this partying is taking place as families get together and friends come back and reconnect with old friends. But there's something else that we can easily miss as we read the story of the birth of Jesus, simply on its own. And we tend to read, that's when we read it. My previous church, we did a series through Luke, and we actually touched on the Christmas story, I think, in September. It's interesting to go to those stories in Matthew and Matthew and Luke and read them out of season, which we hardly ever do. And you get a different sense about what is taking place. There's a lot of mystical and mythical aspects that we've added to the story that we read into it that have come to become so much part of the story. And what gets lost along the way is this larger story of God which has been unfolding, and He's been working out His plan and purpose throughout the course of history. You know, the same thing holds true for our own lives. We don't often step back and realize that whatever is taking place in any given moment of time is part of the unfolding of a larger story that we're simply a part of, but whether or not we recognize that at the time or not. The narrative of our lives is composed of these windows in time when we get a glimpse in a small part of a part of our lives, that these parts fit together for a whole. And they not only form the story of our own lives, but they become the stories, part of the stories of other people's lives around us. We become influential in how their stories unfold as well. So today, as we step back in time to when Jesus was born, I want you to put yourself on the scene back in Bethlehem for a moment with all the festivities going on around you, which maybe depending on your own personality and perhaps are even actively engaged in yourself. In contrast to that situation, that experience of taking place in the town as a whole. Step in and look in on Joseph and Mary. As already mentioned, they would have traveled some distance of 150, 160K, probably on foot for at least one of them, with Mary in the late stages of her pregnancy. Unable to find accommodations, the only place that they can settle down in is a place where animals are used for transportation and were stabled, primarily donkeys and mules, although often favored animals such as goats and sheep were there as well. Now I want you to note a couple of things. One is that they most likely were not in a barn, nor were they in a cave, as some traditions would have it. Very likely not. Some homes had stables connected to main dwellings. That's a bit of a model of what a house might have looked like in Bethlehem. And you can see off to the right there, there's a little corral, a little area there where they stable the animals, or they keep the animals. And then the living quarters are upstairs. There's unlikely that there was even an inn in Bethlehem. You know, the much maligned innkeeper over the centuries did not exist, very likely. So, as I said to somebody earlier, we need to forgive him and we need to move on, because he wasn't there. The town was much too small, probably only about 300 people, something like Elbow, Saskatchewan. Have you ever heard of Elbow? Elbow, Saskatchewan has a population of about 300 people. It's just down the road, by the way, along Highway 42 from Eyebrow, Saskatchewan. Eyebrow has a population of about 130. Now, Diana's mom came from Elbow, so that's why we know about Elbow. And it's a little town on the Diefenbaker Lake. But if you didn't come from there, you wouldn't know that. And if you happen to travel through there, and it's not a destination that I think most of you would think of going to, the prairies in the middle of winter is not a destination anyway that you want to go to. If you went there, you'd probably be hard-pressed to find accommodations, because unless you knew somebody who lived there. That's a lot like Bethlehem. I think there's a little hotel in Elbow, but it's like a typical prairie hotel probably, you know, where you have a number of rooms to rent, and they all have a common bathroom. And it isn't anything like you might imagine or you might want to stay in. Well, Bethlehem is like that. It's not a travel destination, nor probably even a stop along the way to someplace else, unless you already knew somebody who lived there. So as I've reflected on that, of course, begs the question, if Joseph's family traced itself back to Bethlehem, why on earth are they unable to find somebody who would put them up for a night or two? Now you need to understand that the word translated as in this section, otherwise, in another place in Luke, is translated as a guest room. And when Jesus is looking for a room for where to hold the Last Supper, his last meal with his daughter, he asks about the guest room, about the room. And the word for inn that Luke would normally use for an inn like we're thinking about is a different word which he uses when he tells the story about the Good Samaritan who leaves the wounded person in an inn. So the word that is transferred in, is why I chose to have the translation read that is there, was most likely a guest room and not an inn at itself. Well, if the guest room wasn't available, and there was no other place except for the stable, what gives? It's easy to speculate, and that's all we would be doing. I want to make sure clear about that, since we're not told anything more in the text itself. But it's possible that because of the nature of Mary's pregnancy and how it came about, that there was a fair bit of stigma and rejection that she and Joseph would have experienced. And perhaps that is what's happened here. So then you ask yourself, so whatever happened to love, acceptance, and forgiveness, and acting out of compassion rather than judgment? Well, before we point the finger too hard and get too critical, we need to ask ourselves the same question. Is there somebody, perhaps in your family, in your own extended family, whom you would not want to allow to stay in your home, who would not be welcome there, perhaps because of their lifestyle, because you think they're not to be trusted, because of something you've heard about them? We need to be careful here that we don't apply one set of rules to somebody that we read about and aren't living by the same standard ourselves. Whatever the case is, Joseph and Mary find themselves isolated from others, keeping company with the animals. Meanwhile, all these festivities are going on all around town, perhaps even in the very home in which they're staying in the stable down below. And that's when it all starts to happen, doesn't it? Mary's water breaks. Baby's on his way. And I sometimes wonder if that isn't a preview of what is to come. That is that Jesus seems to arrive sometimes on the scene at the most inopportune moments, doesn't he? And sometimes when you want him to arrive, he delays his arrival. All that's an aside. But question here, have you ever been present at the birth of a baby? Well, both our children are adopted, so I did not have the privilege of being there at their birth. However, Diana and I were asked by our son Jonathan and his partner Renee to be present at the birth of their son Damien. I can tell you from firsthand experience that all is calm does not apply to the scene when a baby is being born. It is not a quiet, it is not a nice, clean, little neat thing. And as cute and adorable as little babies are once they're cleaned up and are snuggling with their mothers, that is not the case when they first come out of their mother's womb. My son, who was loyally at the front head of the bed, helping his wife, cooling her down, the doctor says, Jonathan, come here and take a look. The baby's crowning. He went back there, and this is my tough son. He just about got sick and made sure he ran right back to the front. Because when that baby comes out, they're like this gray mass, okay? They're very slimy, very goopy. It's not a pleasant thing, but it's a beautiful thing. Joseph would have needed to take on the role of a midwife. I'm sure something he hadn't done before, since it's unlikely there's anybody else around to help. But in the middle of all that is happening, and I kind of put myself in Joseph's shoes, and conscious to what has taken place outside where the parties are going on, and he's in here being kind of assisting in the birth of this baby that he didn't have a part in reproducing. I wonder if Joseph wasn't wondering, how did I get into this mess? How did I end up here? What on earth is God doing? Have you wondered that at times in your life? How did this all come about? And where is God in all of this? Like most of us, I'm sure in a time like that, he was living in the immediate present without giving any thought to any kind of chain events throughout history that led up to that moment. He wasn't saying, isn't this wonderful? I get to be part of all these events that have been taking place over history, and here it is. It's unlikely that he had even a very clear sense and awareness, full of awareness of who this baby was that he was holding in his arms. Like Joseph, we most often don't realize is that in these moments in time, whether in a time of crisis or part of our everyday life, they're all part of a bigger picture of the unfolding story of what God is doing in our lives and in the world. And He is inviting us to be a part of what is happening. We are either caught up in the moment because of all that is happening, or simply going through the motions of life. Or let's be honest, just simply way too busy to pay close attention to anything or to even connect the dots of our lives. So today, as we connect the dots in Joseph's life, I also want to invite you to take some time to connect the dots in your own life, to examine and discover where God has been at work leading up to this moment in time, and what He might be inviting you to become a part of today and in the future. So once again, let's step back in time. And this time we're going to go way back. We're going to go back some couple thousand years before the birth of Jesus, because we're going to go into Matthew chapter 1. And you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to read it, because it's a list of names. It's the genealogy of Jesus. And most often we skip over all these names, don't we? Because it's tedious reading. And we neglect to realize that each one of those names represents a real person in real time that lived a real life, that had experiences sometimes like ours, that was part of this unfolding course of God's story happening in the world. Well, Matthew goes back to Abraham. And that's where, for Jews, that's where their whole culture and their whole race started. And while he doesn't state it, it takes you back. Anybody reading that and would see the name of Abraham would remember the call that God had on Abraham's life. For I will make you a great nation. First of all, He says, leave your people, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This is the beginning of that promise that God had made and had in mind long before, even before creation. Now, we're not going to go through every name on this long list of Joseph's ancestors. But if we take a closer look, it reveals a variety of characters, including insiders, that is, those who would consider them true Jews, true children of Abraham, but as well as there's outsiders, such as Rahab and Ruth. In fact, contrary to the custom of his time, Matthew includes 4 different women in this list, and all of them would have been thought to be questionable in their own right. First one he mentions is somebody named Tamar. You can read all about her in Genesis chapter 38. She has an incestuous relationship with her father-in-law. Then there's Rahab. Rahab was a woman of a questionable lifestyle who lived in Jericho, who gave shelter to the spies that Joshua had sent before they entered the promised land and had their conquest of Jericho. And because she had done that, because she had shown some loyalty and put her faith and trust in God, she became part of the Jewish people. Rahab, in turn, becomes the mother of Boaz. Last year we did a series through the book of Ruth. Boaz marries Ruth, who is a Moabitess. Again, somebody who's actually forbidden to the Jews to have any kind of connection with. God includes all these we would consider perhaps outsiders in His unfolding story. Her connection, Ruth's connection with the lineage of King David is mentioned at the closing verses of the book that bears her name. And the person who wrote that account could not have even had in mind that someplace centuries later a Messiah would be born, because the concept and understanding and hope of Messiah was not even part of their time at that age. And then finally we find the 4th woman that we find there, and she's not even mentioned name, but we know her as Bathsheba because she's the mother of Solomon. And then Matthew adds this comment that he didn't need to add. Mother of Solomon, she was Uriah's wife. In other words, she wasn't the wife of David, through whom she produced Solomon, at least not at the time. Well, for the faithful in this list of ancestors, and it includes many who were scoundrels and kings, who the commentary in their life was basically they did evil in the sight of the Lord. It could be said of them, of the faithful ones at least, as it says in Hebrews, that all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them. Notice that they saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And then at the end of chapter 11, which is a chapter on faith, this big hall of faith that in the Bible it says, no, actually, they were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Why? Because God had planned something better for us, that only together with us they would be made perfect. And the real sense of that word isn't made perfect, but made complete, brought to completion. I think these are important things to say, because when we begin to see our lives through the eyes of faith, we see not only our lifetime, but we see part of how we are part of this chain of events that has led up to our lifetime, and we are part of something that's going to succeed us in future generations. The completion and fulfillment of your life isn't going to be found in your lifetime. It's not going to be found in your accomplishments, your possessions that you accumulate, everything that you get, the degrees that you do, everything that you accumulate. It's in the legacy that you leave that bears its fruit in successive generations. That's will be the fulfillment, the completion of your life if you live according to God's purposes and you begin to see your life with the eyes of faith. These people that are listed in Hebrews 11, out of which some of them show up in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, could see at a distance with the eyes of faith that which was going to be fulfilled way beyond their lifetime. But notice it was their faithfulness in their lifetime, living by faith, trusting in God to bring about that which was beyond their own expectations, that made it possible for God's plans and purposes to be fulfilled many generations later on. Last week I referred to Jeremiah 29:11, which we so often quote out of context. For I know the plans for you, not to harm you, but to have you have a purpose, a future. But the plan wasn't for those who were receiving that promise to experience that, but rather their successive generations, because it was after 70 years that they ended up back in the land of Israel. In the meantime, they're to make the best of life where they are. Go about their regular lives, build into the lives of their children so they grow up knowing God. And when their opportunity comes to go back, they will go back. Often, in spite of us, and at times even through events that would seem to work against that happening, is the way God works. It's a period of exile in Babylon. But if we take time to go back and read what happened, we find out that God worked through pagan kings, Cyrus, Artaxerxes, and Darius, to orchestrate the return of the Jews to Jerusalem. And similarly here that we read in the chat, it's a decree by Caesar Augustus that moves Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem for where the fulfillment of the prophecy that was given so many centuries earlier could be fulfilled. A little side, by the way, it's a reminder here that when elections take place and the government that we didn't think was a God-fearing government or God-respecting government gets in power, God's plans are not thwarted. God accomplishes His purpose, and He even works through those who pay no acknowledgement to Him to accomplish His plan and purpose. And that's the way it was, where it says that God put on the heart of Cyrus and Darius to allow the return of the Jews to Israel. When we see through the eyes of faith, not only our own lives, but the lives of others and events that are beyond our control, that often affect our lives. We can see how God has been at work through them to bring about His plan and purpose. But along the way, we have a choice to make. We can either work with it, we can sideline ourselves and simply live for ourselves only, and some work against it, even inadvertently. The author of the book of Hebrews gives us examples of those who had long ago to support his definition of what faith is at the beginning of the chapter. And he says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. We see what we hope for through the eyes of faith as God reveals that to us. This is what the ancients were commended for. When what we hope for lines up with God's plan and purpose, not simply with what we want for our lives, but what we want, what we want God to do for us, but what God would want for our lives and to do through us. When we do that, we can be certain of the outcome. That what we do not see in the course of our lifetime, and may not live long enough to see in its fullest sense, it is as good as done. It will come to completion. You are part of something greater than your own life. You're part of something greater than what you can accomplish on your own in your own lifetime. If only you could get a glimpse of what you do not see right now. So I've been giving homework here. I don't know if you kept the sheet that you got last week, but on the last Sunday this month when we come together on the 29th, we're doing a service where you are the sermon. And you get to share how you've celebrated Christmas perhaps in a different way because of some of the things we've been talking about. And I hope you come ready with something that that's touched your heart and you've done something different or doing something about that. So for today, I think this is maybe quite pleasant homework, because I want you to go home. If your grandparents are around, still alive and around and accessible, go and talk to your uncles and aunts, your extended family, generations that are maybe a little bit older. Ask them about their lives. Ask them what they have lived through. Get an understanding for what other generations have gone through for you to be here today. You didn't choose to be born or to live in this place. Somebody chose that for you. We're blessed for where we live. How are you going to allow God to work through that blessing in your life that others can be blessed as well? What is the bigger picture? When you step back from where you are, what is your bigger purpose that God might have for you? Look for where God has been at work already in your lifetime or in your life. And then ask yourself, ask God, given what you can see right now, what purpose does God have for your life? The ultimate purpose being one you can only see through the eyes of faith, but you can be certain of its fulfillment as you begin to see that, even though you only see a bit of it in that sense. You, by the choices you make today in your lifetime, have the opportunity to be part of something far greater than your lifetime. I hope you make that choice. And Father, we thank you that you invite us to be part of what you're doing in the world around us. We often confess that we get caught up in the busyness of our lives, whether it's going to work, going to school, shopping, even in this month with all the celebrations that take place and leading up to Christmas, all the things that take place leading up to the end of the year. But we ask you today that you would show us and reveal to us where you're already at work, where you've already been at work in the past, and how you're leading us into a future that can only be fulfilled as we follow your leading in our lives. Praise in Jesus' name. Amen.